Welcome back to Newsstream 360, bringing you the latest news from around the world. The summer of 2025 brought a cautious hope to Canada. After a long stretch of uncertainty, the country was finally able to breathe a little easier. The air was warm, the days were long, and for the first time in years, Canadians could feel a sense of optimism returning to their daily lives. After years of economic strain, life seemed to be returning to normal. Parks filled with laughter and families gathered for picnics while friends met at bustling cafes to catch up on lost time. The simple pleasures of summer felt like a reward for the hardships endured. Patios in Montreal and Vancouver buzzed with relief as the Bank of Canada lowered interest rates, hinting at recovery. The clinking of glasses and cheerful conversations echoed a collective sigh of relief, as if the entire nation was exhaling at once. Construction cranes dotted Toronto's skyline, and small businesses began hiring again. Storefronts that had been shuttered for months reopened, and the sight of now hiring signs brought hope to job seekers and entrepreneurs alike. But beneath the optimism, the economy was fragile, built on a single powerful relationship with the United States. Headlines hinted at deeper issues, and conversations often turned to worries about what might come next. For decades, Canada's prosperity depended on selling most of what it produced to its southern neighbor. Every day, thousands of trucks and trains crossed the border, carrying goods that fueled both economies. This connection brought wealth, but also left Canada vulnerable to American moods and policies. A single decision in Washington could ripple across the entire country, affecting jobs, prices, and the future of countless families. Household debt remained high, and businesses hesitated to invest, wary of the future. Many Canadians quietly worried about their savings, their mortgages, and whether the good times would last. Most Canadians trusted the steady partnership with the U.S. would continue, rarely seeing the risk as immediate. The rhythm of daily life lulled people into a sense of security, even as warning signs flickered at the edges. The long, pleasant summer days masked a quiet anxiety. Beneath the surface, there was a sense that this peace was temporary, that something could disrupt it at any moment. The shared border symbolized friendship and deep economic ties. It was a line that connected two nations, but also a reminder of how much Canada relied on its neighbor. Few imagined that this foundation was about to be shattered, plunging the country into an unprecedented crisis. The news was filled with distant troubles, but few believed they would reach Canadian shores. The calm was only the surface. Trouble was brewing just out of sight. As the sun set on another beautiful summer day, few realized how quickly everything could change. The storm that would upend Canada's world was gathering in Washington. Tensions that had simmered for years were now boiling over, and the air in the U.S. Capitol was thick with anticipation. Political winds were shifting, and the sense of unease was palpable, not just in government corridors but across the continent. President Trump's administration took a hard line on trade, accusing Canada of unfair practices and not doing enough to stop fentanyl crossing the border. The rhetoric was sharper than ever, with officials and media amplifying the message. The White House made it clear, the status quo was over, and a new era of confrontation had begun. While Canadian officials denied the accusations, the issue became a pretext for a broader economic agenda. Ottawa insisted it was a reliable partner, but the narrative south of the border was relentless, painting Canada as an obstacle to American prosperity. Behind closed doors, the U.S. demanded major concessions, threatening severe consequences if Canada didn't comply. The negotiations grew tense, with American officials pushing for sweeping changes to long-standing agreements. Canadian diplomats scrambled for a solution, but talks in Washington went nowhere. Each round of negotiation ended in frustration, with both sides digging in and little hope for compromise. News of failed negotiations spread, and unease crept into the national conversation. Canadians watched anxiously as headlines warned of economic fallout, and experts debated what the future might hold. Prime Minister Mark Carney tried to reassure Canadians, but the country sensed it had little leverage. His words were measured, but the uncertainty was impossible to hide. The government urged calm, but the public's confidence was shaken. The U.S. seemed determined to rewrite the rules, and Canada was caught in the crosshairs. Every meeting felt like a battle, with the stakes growing higher by the day. The relationship that had brought decades of prosperity was suddenly at risk. Trade, investment, and jobs all hung in the balance as uncertainty rippled through boardrooms and households alike. The sense of security Canadians felt was beginning to unravel. Families wondered what the next day would bring, and communities braced for the unknown, The threat was no longer abstract, it was real, and it was coming fast. Canada braced for impact, knowing that the coming days would test the nation's resolve like never before. On August 1, 2025, the United States imposed a sweeping 35% tariff on nearly all Canadian goods, sending shockwaves through both nations. The announcement came without warning, catching businesses, workers, and families completely off guard. The news hit like a thunderclap. Overnight, Canadian exports to the US became unaffordable. In offices and factories across the country, people stared at their screens in disbelief, realizing that decades of cross-border trade had just been upended in a single moment. This wasn't a targeted dispute, it was a full-scale economic blockade. The border, once a busy artery of commerce, was suddenly choked off, leaving thousands of trucks stranded and businesses scrambling for answers. Cars, oil, seafood, lumber, every major export was affected. From auto plants in Ontario to fisheries in the Maritimes and sawmills in British Columbia, the impact rippled through every corner of the country. The Canada-US-Mexico agreement was cast aside as the US invoked national security. Years of negotiation and cooperation were swept away in an instant, leaving Canadian officials stunned and searching for options. Chaos erupted at the border, trucks lined up for kilometers, shipments stalled, and billions in contracts were suddenly at risk. Perishable goods spoiled, factories halted production, and the ripple effects threatened jobs on both sides. Boardrooms across Canada scrambled to assess the damage. Executives and managers worked late into the night, poring over spreadsheets and contingency plans, trying to understand the scale of the disaster. The intricate supply chains built over decades were torn apart in hours. Warehouses sat idle, assembly lines ground to a halt, and workers faced sudden layoffs as orders dried up. For ordinary Canadians, shock turned to anger and fear. Families worried about rising prices, job security, and what the future might hold as uncertainty spread through communities. The government was blindsided, rushing into emergency meetings. Leaders debated next steps, aware that every decision could have lasting consequences for millions. The optimism of summer vanished, replaced by a cold, hard fear. Streets that had buzzed with life now felt subdued, as the nation braced for what was to come. The border, once a symbol of friendship, had become a wall. Years of trust and cooperation seemed to dissolve overnight, replaced by suspicion and uncertainty. Canada was suddenly alone, facing an economic storm. The crisis had begun, and no one knew how or when it would end. The economic shock was immediate and brutal. The Toronto Stock Exchange plunged, wiping out billions in value. The Canadian dollar tumbled, making imports more expensive and squeezing family budgets. In Ontario and Quebec, car plants halted production, laying off thousands. The ripple effect hit suppliers and entire communities dependent on manufacturing. On the prairies, farmers lost their biggest market overnight. Contracts canceled, prices collapsed, and crops left to rot. In British Columbia, sawmills shut down as US buyers disappeared, devastating small towns. From Atlantic fisheries to tech startups, the story was the same. Livelihoods destroyed in days. The tariffs weren't just policy, they were an economic weapon. Families faced hard choices and the future looked uncertain. The pain was national, sparing no region. The crisis exposed just how deeply Canada's fate was tied to its southern neighbor. The country was reeling, searching for answers. The economic foundation had cracked. The crisis quickly became personal. Job losses led to food bank lines and anxiety at kitchen tables. Protests erupted, laid-off workers in Windsor, farmers in Calgary, all demanding action. The media told stories of shuttered businesses and families in distress. The sense of betrayal was palpable. Canada had been targeted by its closest ally. Anger turned inward with hard questions for the government. How could this happen? Why weren't we prepared? Trust in Ottawa wavered as pressure mounted for a solution. The nation's pain was raw and visible. Ottawa scrambled to respond. Emergency cabinet meetings ran late into the night as the government tried to project calm. Prime Minister Carney promised support for workers and businesses, but Parliament was bitterly divided. The opposition accused the government of failing to anticipate the crisis. Political unity was nowhere to be found. Debate only deepened the sense of instability. Diplomatic efforts in Washington hit a wall. The US refused to budge. Canada's options were grim retaliate and risk escalation, or offer costly aid to industries. Every path led to more hardship. The realization set in, Canada was on its own. Waiting for the US to relent was not a strategy. The government faced impossible choices. The old playbook no longer worked. With Washington unyielding, a radical idea emerged. Canada should apply to join the BRICS Plus bloc. Supporters argued it was a matter of survival, diversifying trade, and escaping U.S. dependence. BRICS offered access to new markets and financial systems outside the American dollar, but the proposal ignited fierce debate. Critics warned it meant aligning with authoritarian regimes and risking even harsher U.S. retaliation. Was Canada trading one dependency for another? The question cut to the heart of national identity. The country was split between tradition and a leap into the unknown. The BRICS proposal was a historic gamble. The stakes had never been higher. As summer ended, the crisis dragged on. The BRICS debate dominated headlines, dividing the nation. The tariffs had exposed Canada's vulnerability and forced a reckoning with its identity. One path meant repairing ties with the U.S., accepting concessions, and hoping for a return to normal. The other meant forging a new, independent course, embracing risk and new alliances. Both choices carried profound consequences. Canadians faced a turning point, tradition, or transformation. The decision was about more than trade, it was about the nation's future. Autumn approached, and the country stood at a crossroads. The next move would define Canada for generations.